So I think I think for us, we're going to keep in mind that there may be three different types of people who might be listening to this based on their age. There are folks who are in high school, they're kids who are in high school, and they're interested in architecture and they want to go into that profession and they want to know whether or not they need to go to school, if it's a good idea, what's the benefits of it. The second would be people who maybe have a degree in something else already, and maybe they've worked for a little bit and they've realized, like, I don't want to do this thing. I want to pivot, and I've always been interested in architecture. So maybe they're between 25 and like 32. Okay. And then the last group, be probably those who've been practicing in something else completely different for the last 2 decades. They've had a career, they're like full-formed adults, and they've decided kind of in the middle of their life or whenever that I don't like this thing anymore. I want to do something I'm passionate about, and I've always been interested in architecture. And maybe the first big question we would answer is whether or not a person should go to college at all. And obviously, we both have degrees in architecture, so perhaps you could say we're a bit biased. But I think it's a worthwhile question to cover because, if you're on social media and you follow some of the big innovators of our time, like Elon Musk, for example, or even entrepreneurs like Gary Vaynerchuk, I think is how you pronounce his last name, there's a group of people who are very successful financially and in other ways who say college is ridiculous. You don't need to go to college. It's a waste of money. I think Musk was even quoted saying that college is basically to prove that you know how to, do groceries and take care of yourself, but that's it. It's to prove that you don't need a babysitter. And I understand kind of like the gist of what he's saying. Obviously, for certain professions, that's a crazy thing to say. Like, you can't become, I would imagine it would be difficult to become a neurosurgeon without going to some kind of school, right?
Well, maybe if you're a neurosurgeon on mice, it's not that hard. I don't know.
Yeah,
on
Barbie
mice.
dolls, sure, then go for it. And so that same question could be applied to architecture, right? Like, can't I just learn these things in practice by working at an office? Why do I have to go to school? Why would I pay tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to architecture school?
I mean, I think it's a good question to ask. And it's sort of, it's kind of like one of those life questions that maybe not many people ask themselves, right? It's the same thing as like, should I get married? Should I get married before I buy a house? Should I even buy a house, right? It's not because that's what everybody is doing. That's what you need to do. And I think that's always kind of my way of thinking is really like what is meant for you, what is right for you. And it might not be like what most society does. But I do think that if you can afford going to college, it's learning about just yourself, taking care of yourself and mature a little bit quicker maybe, and make sure like you can, handle the life challenges of being alone and a student. But I think I don't think nowadays there is very many successful people who can get maybe to where they want to be at without having a degree. If the normal way to get to it is to have a degree. And I said that my dad didn't go to college and he managed to work for a big car company on like super complex stuff because he was nerdy and passionate enough and he figured it out. But I'm not sure that's everybody's path, and I'm not sure that's the safest path to take.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Because in this type of conversation, we are not saying that everybody has to do it this way.
Yeah.
And that nobody should do it this way. There are exceptions. There are outliers, right? And I think safe maybe sounds like a safe word, but it's also like when we talk about these things, it's about what is the greatest chance of success, right, that we can design for or advise for. And when you look at across the board, especially in architecture, yes, having some kind of education, higher level education or degree in architecture is super advantageous for getting jobs and things, which we'll talk about. But also, there are these what do they call them? Content creators out there who are creatives and they produce like videos or they produce some graphic design things and they do NFTs and they're like crazy successful and they didn't do college, like, they're at home doing stuff on their computer. And I get that, but again, those are outliers. And second, architecture is a different beast.
Well, those are outliers, and also I don't think we see the B face of what they show.
Sure.
Like we see what works, Like they show us what works, but they don't show us the struggles and all the things that don't work, and like the downside of doing what they're doing.
Of course.
And the longevity of what they're doing.
And then 99% of the time that it doesn't work out for 99.9% of the people,
Yeah.
and 99 days out of 100 for the one person who is successful when it doesn't work out. I think the other thing too is that, see, architecture school is different from let's say other educations. These are generalizations. So let's say business school is you're learning about economics, you're learning about probably people skills, problem solving, and a whole number of things, right? But a big part of business school for sure is making connections.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why also during the pandemic, business school for what do you call it? MBAs, it was difficult to justify going to an Ivy League when you're not even in person. But so, it's for making connections. And let's say for becoming a surgeon of some kind, you're learning actual skill set, right? Techniques and whatnot. Architecture school is is a weird beast because it's primarily about learning how to think, which is a very abstract, kind of wishy-washy, undefined, vague thing. It's not like I've learned this specific skill set. I mean, there are skill sets, but it's not like I've learned how to do 2 + 2 = 4. Now I take that, now I apply that. It's not like I've made a bunch of connections and now that's my power. Those things, of course, happen in architecture school. But the biggest thing really for a first timer is learning how to think.
It's almost like, when I think about architectural school and the way you're explaining it, I'm just picturing my brain being like pulled in a bunch of different directions and thrown up in the air and kicked and like submerged in water and chopped into pieces and reassembled. And, it's very much about, I think learning about yourself in very many ways, but also, like developing your thinking skills.
What's fascinating about college is that, or university, is that in a way, especially if you're younger, you are paying a lot of money kind of like upfront to free yourself from financial constraints. So what I'm saying is that you don't have a 9-to-5 job. You might have a part-time job to support yourself, but you don't have a typical job. And because of that, when you're in school, especially in undergrad, you have an immense amount of freedom, right? And that freedom can be good. People can be like irresponsible, just party all the time, but can also, and more in terms of the education, be extremely, extremely important because it allows you it allows you the ability to step away from like society and the way everything is structured, step away from the structure, to think outside the box, to be free, to be creative, to experiment, and to allow the brain, as you said, to be pulled in different directions and to think in weird ways and really push yourself in uncomfortable territories. And those kinds of exercises, they're really difficult to do when you're working 9 to 6, 8, 5 days a week, and you have all these responsibilities. So the learning to think creatively and to be free like that is one of the important things about school. And it happens there. It's easier to happen there because, again, you're basically throwing a bunch of money at an institution in a certain sense to buy freedom, right? For the 4 or 5 years or how many years it is. You're free from all the constraints that would typically happen in like normal life.
Yeah. Again, that depends how old you are when you decided to do that, right?
It does. But that's I think, one of the biggest differences. So I suppose the next thing would be, what can people expect from or in architecture school? Right? What am I getting into?
You mean as far as classes, the things you're going to learn about?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I guess one question, is it difficult? What kind of classes can I expect to have? What am I going to learn? Is it worth, the worth of the cost is maybe defined by what the experience is going to be like, but also the outcomes afterwards. But let's just talk about the school itself. What happens in school?
Well, I studied in different countries, so I'm not really sure about what happens here.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, the classes we had in school, there is studio, which is most of...
What is studio?
Studio is basically a studio with a teacher or 2 or 3 on which you do architectural projects. That's where you learn how to design projects. They often give you like a program, a deadline, by program, I mean like, a building of this size, so many floors, so many square feet, and this location on this specific parcel,
Yep.
lot,
And
property.
These are the activities. This is
right?
the function.
And
This can be
you
a
need to
hospital.
have like, it's a hospital, there is a library. It just kind of gives you like the data, the components that need to appear on your project, but they don't tell you how to do it, right? Then the studio is made of a group of students from, I don't know, depending on the year you're in, 20, 25, maybe 10, 12. It really kind of depends on the structure. And you meet maybe 2 or 3 times a week with your teacher and the group to kind of review what everybody is doing. And then maybe like once a month, you have more of a formal review. And at the end of the trimester or semester, depending on how the school is structured, you do kind of a final presentation of the project that you came up with, that you've designed. And you get criticism and feedbacks and, interaction with an audience, and you have to learn how to present. So just the studio course brings a lot in terms of the training of how to think, how to communicate, how to design. You're learning techniques on your own. Sometimes you're learning techniques that maybe the teacher could show you how to do, graphics or plans or models or things like that. Or sometimes you're just experimenting because nobody is telling you exactly how to do things. So it's kind of oftentimes a free-for-all, and depending on what year you're in, it gets less and less guided and more self-exploratory, right? So like I remember in first year, we had projects and we could only use certain materials, and, we had all of the other data, but we were very constrained in what the components that we were supposed to use because we didn't know anything.
Right.
And then you go to fifth year when you do what's called your thesis project in most schools, and you're the one who has to find what the program is about. You're the one who has to establish where the project is located. You have to create it from zero, So that's studio. That's,
I would say,
no matter what architecture school you're in, that is always there.
And studio it's the core class. It's the one you spend the most time on. It's in some places you have what they call cold studio, where you have your desk. It's in a room in a classroom, and it's permanent for that quarter or the semester or even the year, and that's your spot. And you have access to it depending on the school, maybe even 24/7. You can go anytime you want. You're there, and all your friends, your colleagues, your fellow students are in that class with you. Class sizes, as you said, a lot of schools try to keep it around 12 students, but in a lot of cases, because of funding and whatever else, like it goes up to even like 25, which is too many, I think. But that's a cold studio. You also have hot studios where you have a desk, but it's not yours. It's shared by other people. It's on rotation, like a typical like high school class, you could say. But studio, that's the main course, right? And it's like, it feels like at times that's like 90% of the education. That's like 95% of the time where you're spending your time.
And depending on if it's a hot or cold studio, like our school was a hot studio, so everybody was sharing tables. Some people were there all the time. Some were just showing up for the time of the class, the studio time. But if you have a cold studio where you have your own desk, you could basically be working there all the time if you want to.
One of the things that happens in architecture school is there's a really, really strong sense of community. Like the people that are in your studio, especially if they're working there late at night, which happens very often, they become basically your family, your closest friends. You almost can't, your closest friends are your worst enemies because you're in this kind of like foxhole together, right? So I would say, maybe taking a sort of a step back, is that I think some of the biggest misconceptions non-architects have about architecture school is they tend to think that it's much more technical than it is. You learn technical things 100%. You learn about softwares, you learn how to execute things, you learn a bit about building systems, mechanical systems, structures, and those things. You do, and architecture practice in general. You learn about those things, yes. But honestly, and it varies from the schools, but the top schools, we could say, or the majority of the schools, at least I've seen, like 90% of the education is learning about design, like the creative aspect, almost like more like art. If I could make it in a layman's term, if you're talking about like technical things versus more art things, I don't know how to categorize it, like more on the art side, like here's this site, here's this property, here's this location. We're going to build a library. build design a library. What shape should it be, what color, how tall, should it be square, should it be circle, should it be above ground, should it be floating, should it be underground. You have to decide. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions is that I think students, when they get for the first year, a lot of them wash out because they didn't expect that it was going to be this inward looking and it was going to be this undefined, right? It's that lack of definition. It's not paint by paint by numbers. It's nothing like that. It's like make up your own thing, and I'm going to tell you whether or not it's good or bad and why.
Well, then you're talking about studio then.
Studio, yes.
Just studio, because there is other classes outside of studio that, depending on the school you're in, might be a lot more technical than others.
Oh, no, they will be for sure. But again, studio is the main course, right? That's the main thing. Yeah. And if you're not good in studio, not a good chance that you're going to be a good architect. Right. So some typical courses, there's studio where you're doing design projects. It's a project-based course. There's, again, this varies. There's a lot of times structures like engineering, learning about how buildings stand up in different systems.
And we had theory, like structures.
Theory.
Structures is more theory.
Yeah.
And then we had structural like forces, like calculating,
right.
Like how a beam would bend if it's cantilever, like 15 foot out, depending on its size and whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's a little bit more tricky, and not everybody's good at that.
Yeah, so structures, you'll a lot of times have architecture history. That makes sense. You learn about the history of architecture. You'll have an architecture practice course where it's less about design and more about building systems, or how realistic this thing is you design. Like, will this actually stand up? Well, could it be built? How complicated is it? Things like that. And then you'll have sometimes support courses like computer classes and stuff like, and things like this. Architecture theory is another one that I forgot about. And usually those are seminar classes. So a seminar class is distinguished from a lecture class. A lecture class where you sit in a big hall with like 200 people and listen to one person talk for a few hours. A seminar is you're in a small group, typically, again, from like maybe 10 to like 18 students in a room. You read history, you read theory, and you have discussions, you write papers about it, and do presentations. But those are
most of our classes were lectures.
Really?
Most of our classes were in what we called... well, anyway, like the big room with
lecture hall,
yeah. And like 200 people. We had a few like more workshop, but those were very. Right. They were more punctual within the curriculum. They were not happening very often.
Yeah.
Which is a different setting too. Like the ability of participating in a lecture versus a smaller scale course is very different.
One of the classes I always enjoyed the most was seminars. I loved seminars. Because I knew tangents were going to be difficult to avoid in this conversation. Because in lecture halls, you're sitting there with 200 people. It's like 9 o'clock in the morning.
Table,
I'm going to fall asleep, man. You're showing me like 12 Gothic buildings. They all look the same. Like, okay. But seminars, it's a small, intimate group. And I've always loved theory. And I love talking. And debating. And so there's a lot of debating in those sessions. And what's interesting about those architecture theory seminars versus the design studio, it's like, why would you need theory? Why don't you just learn how to design a building? Well, the theory courses provide an opportunity to discuss and have discourse around the designs without actually having to design. And it's a different way to critique and to think. And when those two things start to merge in your work and your thinking, that's when things become like really, really fun and really powerful. But so there you have studio, you have structures, you have history, you have theory.
We had art classes too, like live drawings, sculpture, photography classes too. We had social studies, urban studies. It really depends.
Studies,
I mean, it really depends which country you are in, which school specifically. They kind of each have their own specialty or way they want to focus on how to teach you architecture.
A moment ago when I was saying that architecture school is about learning how to think, and the reason why that happens is that the example I gave earlier is that when you're tasked with designing a building or a piece of furniture, even a lot of times you do furniture in architecture school too. You're not told exactly how to do it. You don't learn steps on how to design a building. There's some general steps, sort of, but not really. And you're not told what it should be either. And again, it's that openness, it's like someone described to me, the design process and designing something feels like, I love this analogy, that that you're floating in the middle of the ocean and you're holding on to this piece of like raft, this debris. And it's the only thing that you're holding on to like stay alive. And there's nothing else in sight. And someone else, in this case, let's say the teacher, sort of says, there's a bigger piece of like door or raft just over there. You got to swim to it and it's going to be much better for you, but you can't see it. And it's a similar thing because it's like there's this promise of something better and you have to there's a lot of risk involved, a lot of fear. And so a big part of architecture school is learning how to accept failure and failing super often.
It is. It's going over the fear of failure, and I think going over the fear of not being able to create.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are probably the two biggest issue any first-year student would be struggling with.
100%. I've said it before on here that the biggest challenge first-year and even second-year students face, and the biggest challenge teachers face when they're teaching those students, is getting them to unlearn what they think they know about architecture, or even, frankly, more broadly, what they think they know about life and the built environment, all the environment,
Mm-hmm.
nature, buildings, cities, streets, all that stuff. People have these preconceptions of what these things are, how they should be, right? If I ask a first-year student to draw me a house, they're going to draw the most generic, dumb, boring house because that's what they think a house is. And when you're asked, like, rethink a house from scratch, it's a really difficult thing to unlearn, right? All that stuff.
You could also find on the other end, like someone who like way overthink what the house should be without even really like any rational or like concept. It's just kind of like trying to impress the gallery,
Right. So I think the other big thing you learn in architecture school, and it fits in with how to think, is you learn how to problem solve. That's probably, in tangent with how to think. That's the thing that you learn. That's the biggest thing. And this is also why, which we will get into, why studying architecture is beneficial, even if you don't end up practicing architecture. Through the process of having to create something from a blank page, almost, and let's say it's a piece of furniture, and then have to build it, have to buy materials, have to problem solve how to cut it, how to source the material, how things fit together. If it doesn't go right, how to problem solve that. Problem solving in multiple dimensions. That's also one of the differences about architecture versus perhaps other professions, is that architecture sits at the intersection of like art and science. This has been said before. So within it, and there's also physics. There's a lot of things. I mean, it has to stand up. It has to have, proper sunlight and ventilation for inhabitants. It has to question society. It has to push society. It has to make sense for the site. There's all these different forces at play that come together onto one project. And you're tasked as a student, design me something that is brilliant and that solves all these things. And tell me also, aside from solving all these things, what's the big question you're asking? What is the purpose of the building? The deeper purpose. It's a lot.
Yeah, like I don't. Yeah, I think if complexity and exhaustion and and perseverance isn't in you, it's probably not going to work out.
And that gets to another question which I'd ask, which is architecture school hard? Is it difficult?
There's different ways to think about it.
Oh, see, you're one of these organized students, so I know your answer.
No, but it's difficult as it's almost impossible for me to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a lot, but you can go through. Right? So there is really two camps. Like, yes, it's not easy.
No.
It's not easy, but if you just focus on the fact that it's not easy and you can get over that, like that's not gonna work, right? Like, if you know it's gonna be a lot of work, it's not easy, but you're ready to go through it, it's gonna work out. It's just a matter of, I think, motivation, perseverance, maybe even ambition, and determination. Like if you don't really have it in you, if you're not ready to like put so much of yourself, your time, and whatever else into it, there is a chance it might not work out, or it might not work out great,
Yeah. I don't want to scare people away, because what happens
But if you love it, if that's your thing, like you love it, you're 200% in it, it could be hard. It's still going to be awesome.
Yeah.
Being hard and difficult doesn't mean like it's not enjoyable and you're not going to be happy with it.
Well, it's extremely rewarding,
Yeah, it's
but
extremely
potentially. But yeah, I don't want to scare people away, and I think this take applies to like high schoolers and also applies to people who are a little bit older. There's kind of self-selection. So if you make it into an architecture school and it's a good one, and it's anything like what we're describing, you will find out in probably the first quarter or semester, so the first like 3 months, or maybe 3 to 9 months, whether or not it's for you.
Yeah.
You'll know. And
you'll probably know, within the first month.
Yeah, it's pretty fast. And again, the biggest misconception people have is going to be much more straightforward, and it's going to be like, oh, I'm drawing doors and windows and like aligning stuff and like whatever. Like that's not
because
really
that's
what
most education you get in other degrees or even in high school and before that is telling you how to do things, right?
Yeah, and I would say honestly, if what you said is correct, right, then I would say architecture school is one of the most precious and like important educations we could as a society like retain and have and preserve and get people to go to, because it's so different from what a lot of high school kids experience today, or a lot of mainly high school and elementary school and junior high. It's super structured. You do X, Y, and Z, all these steps to get to an A. You got to get an A. You have to get a 4.0.
You're being dummified.
And there's a certain amount of like willpower and intelligence it takes to get through that, for sure, like a lot. But it's fundamentally different again from having to question things and have your own critique and opinion that's based on that's not subjective, that's based on logic, and then do something artful and beautiful. Like that's a different thing. And I think we need, just generally speaking, more people that have that ability to problem solve in a creative way, rather than always asking, how do I do it? Right. I just want to know how to do it so I know if I follow these steps, it's going to have a good outcome. Mm-hmm. That guarantee does not exist in architecture school if you're approaching a project correctly. So to the question of whether architecture school is hard, generally, yes, it's one of the toughest types of programs to get into. Anyone who's been in college and that university has, that university has a college of architecture, they will always comment, like the architecture students, they're like up all the time. I walk by that building and the lights are always on. Like, what are they doing in there? It's crazy. Those guys are nuts. Not all students do that. It doesn't have to be done that way. But it's if you're passionate, it's time consuming. It's very time consuming.
I didn't do that.
You didn't do that?
I got my 8 hours of sleep every day for 5 years.
Get out of here.
Maybe not every day, but it's like, it's like asking, I don't know, an actor, or is it hard to get to acting? Well, yeah,
it is if you do it right.
Is it hard to become a lawyer? Is it hard to become a doctor? If you want an easy job and get shortcuts, then you got to find like stuff that's easier and quicker to get.
One of the things that a recent guest, David Thompson, who's an architect, had said that, I think he's the one who said it, that architecture school is also interesting because it's almost like the more effort you put in, the more you're going to get out of it. Not just in terms of personal reward, but also like the better the design will be.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are limits to that. There's the question of efficiency and sleep deprivation and things like this. I get that. But generally, it is a thing where the more dedicated you are, the better your work is going to be. And perhaps that's different from other things. I'm not sure, but it's and because it's a creative field, and if you're passionate, that well of questioning is like almost endless. It can always be better, and that is problematic at some point. But so yeah, it is difficult, I would say.
It is difficult, and 5 years studying something, it's a decent amount of time. It's a chunk. So, like some other degrees might be 3 years, and it goes by much, much faster. So you really have to be into it to go through the 5 years, because it's a lot. It's
a lot. But again, you don't need to know that at the beginning. You're going to find that out once you start.
You don't need to know that. And when I applied for architecture school, I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah, same actually.
Which retrospectively, I don't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing. Definitely some stuff I wish I knew before I jumped in, but also maybe, I feel like maybe these days, like people want to know everything in advance before they do it.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because of access of information is, like right under our fingertips. I don't know, but part of me kind of like the fact that I went in it without knowing much. And it worked out for me. A lot of other people I knew who started architecture school, it didn't work out, or they dropped out after 2-3 years. They didn't make it through the end. So maybe you do need some information. But
I've said this before on here, but I think it's a better way to go into the programs. Architecture school is not having any expectation, because again, it's the unlearning. People get into trouble when they come into architecture school in year one, whether they be 19 or 27, and they have an idea about architecture, and they struggle the most. It takes them longer to get to the point of other students because they have to, again, recondition their mind.
Yeah, no, it's better to go as a virgin.
In a way, yeah. And I want to answer another question which just came up, which is, what should I do to prepare to go to architecture school? Because we get asked this a fair amount. And people think, like, should I take CAD courses, learning how to do CAD drafting? Should I take engineering courses? Should I take drafting courses? I'm not blaming these people, because why would they know any better? But everyone assumes that, and rightfully so, that if you're going to go to architecture school to prepare for architecture school, which is, designing building stuff, that I should learn more about buildings.
Right.
And
my advice would be do nothing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Just come in the virgin?
Just come and be ready to absorb and do it when you're there.
I would say...
enjoy your free time while you have it until you start architecture school.
I understand that learning CAD and some of these skill sets could be helpful, but the thing is, when people focus too much on the skills rather than the larger purpose of what you're doing, which is the larger purpose of architecture, the skill sets end up driving the creative thinking rather than them being in tangent or them being the opposite even. This sort of reminds me, like, we interviewed actually a former band conductor, like wind ensemble conductor of mine on here. And he was saying that one of the biggest mistakes he sees in conductors, and the guy with the baton who waves the stick, and in young musicians, is that they focus too much on the technique. And they forget that the point of this whole thing is to create beautiful sounds, to be lyrical, to be creative, to be artistic, to create emotion, to tell a story. And they let the technique be the thing they focus on. And they have all this, like, fast fingers and stuff, but they don't have anything else. And so it's a roundabout of saying, in preparation for architecture school, the things I personally would recommend, if anything, would be to take creative classes. Meaning, like, take sculpture, take painting, take figure drawing, take fucking even dance. Like, take things that have to do with expression, that have to do with creating something from nothing, and have to do with that process of being genuine and understanding yourself and making a statement. Creative writing, even, that would be fantastic. Do that kind of stuff.
That, and I think also... that's a very good advice, and I would definitely recommend that, because
you changed your
position. I was gonna say that you could take, like, some, like, like creative workshops. So go sign up for a pottery class, or, like, an improvisation stand-up comedy or something, right? But you're right, like something that maybe gets you out of what you know in a creative way, and also puts you in an environment with other people. Because architecture school is not an individual study thing. There is moments when you're on your own to study, but I personally struggled a lot, I think, the first year or two, being in a room with other people, and I had to create, surrounded by people looking at what I was going to produce.
Sure.
And, it takes a while to feel comfortable, sketching or modeling in front of other people when you don't know what you're doing. Because you're thinking, what I'm doing is not good, they're better, and how, nobody's telling me how to do it. Like, there is a lot of kind of like personal fear in the process of creation. So putting yourself out there and surrounded by people doing the same thing that you're doing, I think is super important.
Very important. One of the big takeaways regarding the experience of architecture school, maybe I already said it actually, is community. I mean, it's so intense, and you can gain community from other places, but it's it's like a pressure cooker architecture school. It's like it densifies community, it densifies everything, right? It's an incubator, like a highly intense incubator. And you're surrounded by, if it's a bigger school especially, you're surrounded by people who are in this and think about it constantly. You're surrounded by teachers and professionals who are questioning, pushing the boundaries and know their stuff. It's a learning environment, you know.
And I think if you get into that kind of community feeling and thinking before you get to architecture school, it will probably put you in a better mindset than if you come out, let's say, like right of high school, where maybe you're in a more competitive mindset. And I do remember, like, you know, in France at least, schools are very competitive. People are kind of jerks to each other.
Okay.
And it's always like, you know, like they're competing. Like the feeling of community happens a lot in like the art fields. But in architecture school there, it was, you know, this studio is competing against this studio. They're looking down at each other's projects. It's not a good mindset. Like, I completely disagree with that. And that's actually what shocked me the most when I came to California to study, was to see that people are not competing. And it might be because of the hot studio versus the cold studio, where the feeling of community develops or doesn't, right? But if you can bring that to the table, maybe you have a way to make the studio feel like a collective group, like a community group, and not like competing individuals.
The last thing I'll say with the experience is that it's a lot of fun. It's like, it's the extremes. It's highs and lows. It's a ton of fun. So that's the experience of architecture school. I think another question people would ask to decide whether or not they should study architecture is, what is architecture practice like? Because obviously you're kind of doing architecture school presumably to practice architecture and to be a professional. So we've talked about this a lot in the past, so I don't want to take too long about it, but I just want to cover a few things. First of all, architecture practice a lot of times is very different from architecture school. That's also a difference in this profession. Like, people think that the things, let's me how to describe it. The things not only the things you learn in architecture school, but the things you do in architecture school. You take that like as a learned, let's say, recipe or whatever, and then that happens in practice. And you do that in practice, and now you're good for practice. Like, my 5 years of architecture school degree or 3 years of degree is worth 3 years of professional experience, like that is with the trade school, for example. That's not the case. After 5 years of architecture school or 7 years of architecture school, if you've never practiced before, when you get to year 1 of practice, you're worth
nothing.
6 months of experience, maybe.
Yeah.
Like 2 months of experience if you have 0. Like, it's not worth a whole lot. That's not to say it's not worthwhile to do architecture school, but it's to say that, you know, that they're not the same thing, if that's clear enough, you know.
No, they're not the same thing. It's really like, you know, maybe there is theory and there is practice, and
Sure.
school is theory, let's say,
A bit more,
and
yeah.
the professional world is practice. And even if you've done like a few internships, like, still your experience is peanuts.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because there are architecture schools that are much more technical and they're more practice-based. And in those places, it's not really about asking big questions of society and culture like I was describing before. It's more about, we're not going to ask those big questions. We generally know what a building is. We want it to look good and function well. That's all we're trying to do. And this is like the things you need to learn to do that in practice. That's fine. We probably need more people who can do just that. Okay. So I'm not downplaying the importance of that or saying it's not valuable at all. But if you ask any architect, capital A, like movement creating architecture, the purpose of architecture, that's not the purpose of architecture.
Yeah.
Right. You're creating good buildings. A good building's not the same as architecture. You can listen back to a recording. We talked about the distinction between the two.
You know, I went to architecture school and architecture profession, and I don't think I've ever spoken to an architect before I did that. I've never met an architect.
Well,
you know,
because...
I've learned about architects like building castles in France and like whatever, right? But I don't think I've ever met an architect before I did that. And I mean, you know, if like a high schooler was like, oh, should I be speaking with an architect before I go to architecture school? I would be like, you can.
It depends.
But you don't have to.
The profession is really really, really broad. Probably broad. I would say it's broader than most professions. There's a lot of different types of architects of different backgrounds, different focuses, not just in building type. I don't mean like, oh, ones that do houses versus one that do towers. I mean, there's ones that are theoretical and they almost do no buildings. They do all art installations. There are ones who practice in different countries. There are ones who are really having the theory and they do like real buildings. There are ones that do a lot of good building, but they're just buildings. There are ones that are pushing the envelope. There are ones that are using digital technology and CNC machines. It's crazy the amount of variety.
But I feel like maybe digging into like those different specialty or even the profession itself might not be something you need to do on year one. It's probably something like if architecture is really a passion of yours, right? I don't think you need to like fill your head with all that stuff in year one. I think you could wait until like, I don't know, year 3 to like think about like, okay, what kind of project do I want to do? Like, where do I want to go? Like, you know, like be more specific, but
later.
I would just go in as free as you can, as free of preconception and like what you think architecture should be or what people are telling you architecture should be.
I think we did a recording about choosing the right architecture school for yourself for undergrads. I believe we did, so you should go back and listen to that. But generally, I am in agreement. If this is your first time in architecture, I suggest that people go find a program that is more, let's say, middle of the road, for lack of a better expression, rather than being hyper specific in one way or another.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you know, you're limiting your options before you even understand what the options are and what they really mean.
Yeah.
And I don't advise that. But back to the profession. So it's different from school, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. The pay is low. The hours tend to be very long.
I mean, it's higher than some of the things, but it's definitely lower than what a lot of people think architects make.
Yeah. And maybe this is a good chance at this moment to talk about, you know, the finances of all of this, right? And I would say probably, you know, someone asked me, should I go to architecture school? Again, a bit biased because I did architecture school. I taught architecture for a period of time. I would give them a resounding yes to anybody. I'm interested in dentistry mostly, but I'm kind of interested in architecture. Go to architecture school. But the biggest reason
it
why...
It would make you a better dentist at the end.
Probably, honestly.
Probably.
The reason why I would tell somebody... I'm going to expand on that. People are confused by that statement. Why would it help you as being a dentist? Because you learn how to think... You learn how to problem solve and to think in different new ways in architecture. So you find a lot of architects who go to different professions and they bring something new because they have that skill set to problem solve and to think outside of the box.
But I think that's, you know, that's an advice that in general always works, is if you have something that makes you different from other people in the group you're in, use that more, because I mean, it will help out the other people around you, but also because you're going to cross-pollinate, you know, in many ways. So you're applying to school, you're different, you're coming from a different place. You have to use that. You're in a work environment, you have a different background, use that.
So then going back to what was I saying before? The biggest, so I would tell everyone, go to architecture school. But the biggest reason to not go to architecture school is the financial constraints, or how much it costs, basically. How much it costs to go to architecture school. Depends
Don't
on where
go to architecture school in the US.
Okay. In a lot of cases, if we're talking about a B.Arch or B.S. or a B.A. or even an M.Arch, you know, the student loans and the student debt, right, is what we're talking about, could be in the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's certainly tens and tens of thousands of dollars. Now, I've wrestled with this question, you know, if you're a person who doesn't come from money, you have to pay for your own education, and you do plan on like having a few kids, and kids cost money, and, you know, and you have no support, should I go to architecture school? I've landed on yes still, but I do it with having had thought about it a lot, because it's a lot of money to try and pay off. So let me describe for people who don't understand like finances at all, for like the younger folks. If you go to architecture school and let's say you have $100,000 of debt afterwards, right? Most people that we know, it would take about 10 years to pay off their student loans, depending on the school they go to and how much it costs and whatnot. 10 years is a long time. So if you finish school and you're like, I don't know, 22, 23, 24, 25, if you're doing a B.Arch or an M.Arch, you're paying off your loans. You're not done until like you're 34 potentially, or maybe even later. And this sounds silly, but biologically for women, if you want to have a kid, that becomes an issue, because it's crazy to think that you are in debt up until, hopefully only up until you're about to have a kid. And we were talking on Instagram with some people about this because it came up recently, and they were saying, well, the average amount that you make as a graduate, I think right now is like, I want to say $50,000, 45, 50, something like that.
I mean, it depends which year you're graduating in. If you're graduating now, maybe less.
Sure.
If you're graduating during recession,
But about that amount of money-ish, maybe 35 to maybe 55, for someone who has zero experience, that seems about right. And then by the time you practice for about maybe 9 years, you're probably going to make around $90,000 after 9 years. Now, for someone who's never really held a job or had to pay rent or insurances, that sounds like a lot of money. I know for me, when I was a student, like, you're kidding me? $35,000? I could buy a car. I could buy a gold. I could buy anything I want with that kind of money. You would be amazed how quickly all that just evaporates.
Yeah.
You negotiate a salary of $50,000, and if you just graduated, you're king of the world. I could buy a private island in a few years if I wanted to. It all disappears. So real quick, let's imagine that 30% of it goes away to taxes. Then you have rent. If you're living in a big city, rent is going to be at least, I don't know, $1,200, $1,500, maybe even $2,000 a month. Then you have food, you have groceries, you have eating out on occasion, you have health insurance, you have car insurance or transportation. And so with all
your
that,
student loans,
excluding any vacations or any extra expenses that come up, like you have to medical expense you didn't expect, excluding all that stuff, which always happens, you have not a lot of money left over. And you have student loans, you have zero. We've known plenty of people who went to schools, they practiced as architects, 10 years to pay off, and for the first X number of years, yes, of course they went out, they had drinks every now and then, but their savings, basically zero. Unless they figure out a way to live with their parents for 6 years, which is God, that doesn't sound like fun. And then they're able to pay off loans quicker. But I'm telling you, it is brutal. It is brutal to have that much debt for 10 years. It's not easy.
So the key is find a boyfriend or a girlfriend who's not an architect, who's doing really well for themselves. Yeah. Because honestly, that's probably your best bet if you want to remain in the architecture industry. So, and
I say this because there is this perception a lot of people have that architects make a lot of good money. Someone else on Instagram recently left a comment and they were saying, I'm an architect, I'm a mother of two, I finally paid off my loans after about 10 years. Finally, I feel like, okay, I'm out of it. And she was like, what did she say? I think the story was, I was on a flight, flying in coach, the standard seating, and the guy next to me, we were talking, he asked what do you do? And she said, I'm an architect. And he's like, you're an architect? What are you doing here? Why aren't you flying first class with the lawyers and the doctors? And the story highlights the point that a lot of people think architects make really good money.
You can't afford a $3,000 flight ticket, to go from, I don't know, New York to California in business class.
Can architects make a lot of money? Yes. Do some architects make a lot of money? Yes. For the average person working at an average office as an employee, no, you're not making a lot of money. And again, maybe numbers get distorted for younger folks, but compared to other professions like the doctors or the lawyers or the other folks who have paid just as much money to go to school and are licensed professionals and have liabilities, like architects have a lot of liability, no, it's not a lot of money. So maybe that's all kind of depressing, but I want people to understand that, and but I also don't want to say that that should necessarily be. That's the truth, and I wish that wasn't the truth. But I also don't want to discourage people from doing architecture because
no, but there might be
so
a good
rewarding
information to have when you're deciding which school to go to too.
Yeah.
If one school is a lot more expensive and you're gonna get the exact same job as someone who went to a cheaper one that's still pretty good, you might saving yourself 4 years of paying student loans. So.
So that's architecture practice. I think one of the big questions is, does having a degree in architecture of some kind help me with getting a job?
I would say definitely. I mean, we've known a few people who, let's say, got hired in offices as like receptionist, or maybe like kind of like lower level staff that managed to go up the ladder
or transition
over to something they were definitely more interested but didn't have the experience or training into, such as, let's say, interior design, or it could even be like graphic design.
They went from graphic design to. You're saying they went from graphic design to architecture? Or receptionist to graphic design?
No, I'm saying we actually know people who like studied graphic design and started as a receptionist in an architecture office, and eventually like move up to be their graphic designer or like their master renderer, right? Like,
okay.
Or got into interior design within that office, but I've never come across anyone who came to work in an office I was in, let's say. Not trained as an architect and was doing design work as an architect that I would do.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty rare. I don't think many people would have the courage or even the idea of applying to be an architect in an office if they have no experience or training at all.
And I want to highlight that sometimes examples they seem out of proportion, or they get proportioned differently in people's minds. Like the example you gave of a person who studied graphic design and ended up becoming an interior designer or receptionist in interior design. That's like the one person. Like literally the one person I've ever heard of was through you.
Oh yeah.
Like one out of like hundreds or thousands of architects I know. Like the answer to the question, I agree with you. The answer to the question is, does it help getting a job? Yes. Can I get a job not having a degree?
Probably
anything
not.
Is possible, but no, it's going to be nearly impossible.
You would not be hired for the position you're applying to.
It's going to be really difficult. Maybe you'll get hired as a draftsperson, and then after being a draftsperson for a year or so, you prove your abilities there, and you move up. But here's the thing. Architecture school is the experience that unites all architects together.
Yeah.
Really. There are outliers that never studied and whatever, but that's like the 0.01%. That's the thing that unites everybody. That is our common ground. That's where our relationships are formed. That's where our thinking is formed. Going back to thinking again, that's where we are formed. Now we continue to develop and evolve a lot, like dramatically in the profession. Like the profession is, you can't really compare, but let's say 30% of an architect is education, 70% is profession. But that 30% is not like happening wherever. It happens at the beginning, at the foundation. And so all the places I worked at, all the places that I know more or less firsthand or secondhand, I don't, why would they, and the thing is there are a lot of architecture graduates, like a ton. Why would they hire somebody who has no architecture training background at all? And when they have a whole bunch of really qualified candidates, they're not going to. And it's not even to do, again, with skill set. It's not to do with, oh, you're good at CAD. They're not good at CAD. Because when it comes to hiring, if an employer's smart, and generally this is what's going to happen, the skill sets are important. If you don't know how to use this program at all, well then, maybe I don't want to train you. And sometimes though, it's like, I don't care if you don't know the program. Your ability to think and problem solve is what I care about. And your ability to work in a team. Those are like the biggest things, like without a doubt. You can do that? Fine. I'm going to teach you Revit. I don't care. I'll pay $800 and send you to Revit school for 2 days. There's no way that if you're this other candidate who knows Revit, knows CAD, but it doesn't have any creativity at all, they're not going to hire you unless they want you only for that. In that case, you're going to be stuck in that position. And if you're wanting to be a technician, that's fine, but that's not what we're talking about, right? So yeah, unfortunately or whatever, I think it would be very difficult to get a job, in a design sense. It could happen, but it's just.
I mean, now if you need to have a master in architecture, well, maybe that's another question.
The thing also is that even for you as an individual, right? Let's talk about it from the perspective of personal growth as becoming this fantastic world-changing architect of the future. It's going to be difficult for you to acquire the thinking skills and the problem-solving skills in practice because of what I said at the very beginning, because practice comes with constraints. And frankly, a lot of offices who are started by partners who went to architecture school. They did crazy, abstract theoretical things, and they were expanding the world and all that stuff in school. When they get to practice, they have an office for 15 years. A lot of that kind of energy and juice gets dwindled away because practicing architecture is really difficult and there's a lot of constraints and it's frustrating. And they end up producing, again, they're really great buildings, but they're not like maybe pushing the boundaries. And because it's just there's a lot. I mean, there's like building codes, there's clients, there's like structures, there's like contract, there's all these things, right? And so being in a practice, generally, it's hard to have that kind of freedom of space and freedom of thinking and practice for a newbie.
And it's like, when, let's say you have been working in another field and you decide to go back to school to become an architect.
Mm-hmm.
When we talked about the best is basically to be a virgin when you come to architecture school. And I still think it is because we've seen a lot of people who go back to school for architecture when they weren't. And society has already formatted them to think of things a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And having this kind of like gap time between, between high school and architecture school, using the architecture school as a gap between high school and the profession, right? Is crucial in having the freedom to develop your critical thinking and your creative thinking. And if you don't have that gap happening at this moment in life, but you graduate from high school, you start working, and then you go back to school for it.
It's difficult.
It's difficult. It's not the same thing.
And I think that gets to another question, which is, when should I go to architecture school? Which, most folks listening, you don't really have a choice. Like I'm this age, I can't go back in time. But I would agree with you generally, and I've seen that in teaching generally that people who come into architecture school after and when they're older, their brain has become formed. I had read this thing or heard it or something, and I don't know if it's true, but whatever, it works as an analogy or as a piece. That if you kind of dissect a younger brain, it's squishy, and like the ridges in it are like they're less deep. It's more like malleable, you could say, in a way. And older brains are much more crystallized. And it has to do, in the piece, it had to do with like how locked in a person's thinking is. And the older you get, generally, the more crystallized and firmed and formatted your thinking becomes. And the ideal time to go to architecture school is, as you said, it's at that junction. It's before you've hit society and you've been told you need to do it this way, you need to do it this way, you need to do it this way.
And don't get me wrong, I mean, having older students, being in studio surrounded by younger students is very beneficial for the younger ones because there is a maturity and a certain level of calmness that they could bring to it. But I don't think, same applies to the older students.
Yeah, generally, but I think also, older students, they have an advantage because they are more organized and they also take things more seriously. So it's not like all a loss. I'm not saying that. Like, it's certainly possible. But it, again, it's about mindset. It's about the position that you're coming from, right? And the position you choose to come from mentally. Okay, so can I get a job without a degree? I think it's difficult to do, really difficult. And then there's a question of, it's kind of a twofer. Like the one question is, can I just get a degree in something else and then go to architecture? So in other words, I'm interested in interior design. I'm interested in graphic design. I'm interested in planning and real estate. All of those, or a combination of those, and architecture. I'm not sure which one to study. Which one should I do? Like, if I get a degree in interior design, can I do architecture afterwards? Like, they seem to be very close. Or planning, or real estate, of course. Can I do real estate and then do architecture? Unfortunately, it's very difficult. I think very difficult.
What is difficult?
To do one of those degrees and then go to architecture, because you're not going to have the portfolio for getting a job.
You're not, and I feel like the architecture training is so broad and good that it's probably easier to go from that into something else.
From architecture
to something else than the reverse. Also because in a way architecture training is pretty general.
Yeah.
In a way that it's going to open a bunch of doors of interest that you might not even know when you start.
Yeah.
Right. And you don't have to be specific when you start architecture school. When maybe if you start graphic design, like what else can you do when you come out of graphic design school? Packaging design, okay, great.
Yeah, right.
Letter pressing, okay, great. What else? Like you're pretty much limited. But there is a lot of people who went to architecture school that went into, I don't know, like fashion or tech or real estate, or they just pivoted because that training gave them a way to get into the other ones in a way as almost a preparatory training, or it gives them the mindset to get into, those other fields. So I would say go to architecture.
Yeah. If you're interested, so like the 5 that are listed and you're not sure which one to study, and you're like, I don't know what I want to do like for the rest of my life, like 6 years after I graduate, like which one should I do? Do architecture, 100%. You will be able to pivot to one of those. And you also highlight an important point that in the education itself, you were exposed to so many different things. Like it's kind of like, it's amazing how many different things you get exposed to when you're in architecture school if you do it right. There is real estate. That doesn't get talked about enough. There's a little bit of urban design. There's sociology. There's anthropology. There's geography. There's certainly structures. There's, of course, interior design. There's sustainability. There's energy. There's like... And the social studies component is something that people don't think about very often. The philosophy, there's a ton of philosophy in architecture, like not architecture specific philosophy. I'm talking about philosophy in general.
Yeah.
And it's this uniquely broad education that forces you to figure out how these crazy different things can become intertwined and how they intersect and what they mean in empowering the design of a physical thing. How does all that stuff I just mentioned inform the creation of like a house? Oh, it's crazy, but that's the architecture education, and as a result of that, I mean it's great just because you get exposed to a bunch of different stuff. I mean that's one of the things I've liked about it the most. So yeah, I would say 100%. If you're debating between those things, do architecture. You're going to get the skill set, the ability to think that's going to be powerful in almost anything you do afterwards, like 100%. And you're going to get exposed to a bunch of different things anyway in architecture. I think that's pretty clear.
Oh yeah, I mean the quality of the training you get in architecture school is there's nothing like it, you know.
Another one comes up is that should I go to architecture school if I know that I want to become an architect and become a licensed architect specifically? So super quick, because we've talked about it before, there's no such thing as and this is all this conversation is only within the United States. I don't know what it's like in other places. You do in France a little bit, but the numbers and all the things we talked about, that's the United States. They're becoming licensed. So in the States, there are only licensed architects. You cannot call yourself an architect. You can't use the word architect in your professional title anywhere unless you're licensed. It's actually not allowed. It's legally not allowed. You can't call yourself an architectural designer. You can't be an architectural interior designer, inter-architect. You can't do any of that unless you're licensed. Now, to get licensed, there's a couple different paths. Either you have some kind of formal degree in architecture, and then you have to get a little bit of experience and practice, and then you take, I think it's 6 exams now, and then you're licensed. Mm-hmm. The other path is you don't have a degree, but you practice for like 10 years or something crazy. You take exams, and then get licensed. So if you want to spend 10 years before you get licensed, then go ahead and do that. But generally speaking, it's super beneficial to have a degree in architecture to get licensed because it's a shortcut in a certain sense. Now, within that, there are 2 different education paths you go down. Maybe this is a chance to talk about the different degrees. There's Bachelor of Architecture programs where you have a Bachelor of Architecture, a Bachelor in Architecture, right? Those are 5-year programs. After you graduate with that degree, after 5 years, assuming it doesn't take you longer, you can start taking your exams, get those couple years of experience, and you're licensed. The other path is that
which total might take you 10 years anyway.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's true. So the other one is that if you, instead of doing 5 years, a professional degree, the BArch, you do a 4-year degree there where you're studying architecture, but it's not an actual bachelor's, right? So it's a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Sciences, and those are 4 years, right?
Right.
Then you tack on top of that a Masters of Architecture 2, an MArch 2, that's what they call it. And I think that's 1 or 2 years long on top of the 4 years. So it's 6 years of education. Then you can go get your license.
Gotcha.
So a lot of people will do like, I think Boston, is it Boston University? Boston something is like a 4-year program. You're studying architecture, but it's not a professional degree. It's not 5 years. After those 4 years, most students will opt to go to a grad school like Harvard or Columbia or any other place to get that MArch 2. The third route is you have...
Wait, is that something that school explain to students when they sign up? Like, do you kind of have to watch out for that?
I don't know.
Because, I mean,
I would assume they would
it would
explain
be
it.
good to know before you sign on a school that, hey, you might need to pay an extra year or two if you want to be a licensed architect.
Yeah.
Right? That might be something to
Well,
know.
we're saying it now.
Well, yeah.
The third route is that you're a person who has no formal higher education in architecture at all. You would go do a Master's in Architecture 1, an MArch 1, and I think that's 3 years. And then that's a third path. But anyway, so does having a degree help you get a license? Yes, depending on the different paths you take. If you want to do it, let's say, as quickly as possible, you do a Bachelor of Architecture 5-year degree. Right.
Just quickly and cheaply as possible.
I honestly don't see any, unless it's as for financial reasons aside, if you had 2 schools and it costs roughly the same per year, and you had a BArch and a Bachelor of Science or Bachelor of Art, Architecture Studies, it's 4-year versus 5-year. I don't know why you wouldn't do the 5 years. I know.
I mean, if the school is more focusing on the arts while teaching architecture, maybe that's more your thing. Like, maybe I could understand it. But also you could just find an architecture school that gives you a 5-year degree that's more focused on the arts, and then you just do 5 years there.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely something to watch out for the newbies that are looking into, like getting a degree and maybe at some point getting a license. It's, even knowing that you have to have a professional license to become an architect might not become a knowledge.
I don't think so.
And then also when you start architecture school, you might not even know if you want to be a licensed architect. You might not even know what it means to be a licensed architect. Let's say you don't know you want to have your own office yet. And to be honest, you might not even need to be a licensed architect even if you have your own office. So those are kind of maybe big questions to ask when you start, but it might be good information to know from the beginning if you already have an idea of how you want things to go when you get out into practice.
Generally with MArch 1 programs, because I've seen them firsthand, when there are people who have never studied architecture before, they're taking 5 years of education from the BArch and they're cramming it into I think it's 3 years for an MArch 1. And it's generally the students who are older, right? Because they're not high school kids, because a high school kid would just do a BArch. And it's brutal. It's difficult
it's a lot.
To try and cram that in. It's crazy.
It doesn't sound good.
And I do feel like that actually to learn the fundamentals of architecture, it takes 5 years, a full 5 years.
It takes 5 years, and your last project, and at the end of 5th year, you still feel like you do nothing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And then you start working, you're like, yeah, you know what? I really don't know anything.
So that was actually all the big questions I had written down for whether or not a person should go to architecture school. I think for high schoolers, maybe it's more straightforward. If you're a little bit older, the biggest thing really, because I was conversing with someone about this on social media, the biggest thing probably is the financial concerns that you'd have to have. Because when you're older, you have responsibilities again, and you need to make sure that you can keep meeting those and satisfying those while going back to school and whatnot. And I don't want people. I just don't want people to think they're going to go to get this degree and then they're going to go out and afterwards make a ton of money and pay off loans super quick or whatever.
No,
and
that's kind of unfair for them not to know those things before they sign on for big loans.
Yeah,
you should have that information.
But even with the big loans, even if you don't come from money and it takes a long time to pay off, I've decided, my opinion might change, I don't know, but I've decided still worth it. Because just the personal journey is so rewarding that I can't, Like I paid off loans. It took me a long time, right? I'm one of those people that I just described. I cannot imagine where I would be, like, just not financially, but like personally in my mind and who I am as my makeup and what my knowledge and my outlook on the world. I can't imagine who I would be and what I would be without having gone to school. It's highly formative, and things are always evolving and changing, of course, but it's a special time. Like I said before, it's a pressure cooker, it's an incubator, nothing else like it, because you're free. And
if you have the ability to study in a country that doesn't cost an arm to go to school, and then also do that.
Even better. So yeah, was there anything else that you want to cover with this one?
I mean, I think, the bigger outcome too is that at the end, it's a very rewarding job. It takes a lot in school and after school. But if it's something you really love and you're ready to be dedicated to, it's extremely frustrating, extremely difficult, but also very rewarding. Yeah. And you have the possibility to change people, to change cities, to change how we do things, to change how we live. And, you have different ways you can go about what you do after, which is, an amazing choice to have after you graduate. You're not pigeonholed into one job. Like, you have options, really. So if you want a training that gives you option of what you can do after, I think architecture is one.
Cool.
Do it.
Cool.
Do it and let me know how it works out.
Okay, sounds good. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, just contact us. But we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, but mostly Instagram.
We also have a giveaway going on.
Yep. Still going on. The giveaway is a free architecture guidebook. It is the Architect's Studio Companion. I imagine if you're a listener of this episode in particular, this book is a necessity. It's probably mandatory for you to buy at some point, or highly recommended. It's 495 pages. In this case, it'll be the latest edition, the 6th edition. I have a copy from when I was in school. It's super helpful. It takes you through the fundamentals of architecture in a certain way. It's diagrams, it's structures, it's a lot of things. So you can win this book for free, open to people in the U.S. because I don't want to have to ship it international. To win the book, all you have to do is leave a review of our show in the Apple Podcast app. It's pretty straightforward. If you're somewhat tech savvy, you can figure it out. If not, we have instructions on our website. In the upper right, it says how to leave a review. You can follow instructions. Before you hit submit on your phone, before you hit submit for the review, take a screenshot of it. Because when we announce the winner at the beginning of May, as I think we're going to do it, we announce the winner, then we ask that person to send us the screenshot as proof that they actually left the review and they're not lying. Then you give us the address and we mail you the book. So the Architect's Studio Companion, it's it fluctuates on Amazon, but somewhere between $80 and $100. Like, it's a legitimate hardcover book.
It's a great book to have on hand. I mean, you can find everything online, like all of your answers to any question. It's always great to just have a book you can kind of flip through.
100%.
So, that's a really good one.
Hey, YouTubers, thank you so much for watching this show. If you like what we're doing, then please support us by hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment on here. You can also find us at secondstudiopod.com. We really appreciate that you're watching. Stay tuned for more things, and more episodes are coming out next week. Bye.